What's Card Wars?
It's a fantasy card game that's super complicated and awesome, but, well, oh, it's kind of stupid. Never mind.
My goal is to create a show-accurate tabletop version of Card Wars, the iconic Adventure Time card game, and have decided to publicly document that suffering. There are already official adaptations of the card game, but they take a lot of liberties to make a digestible, playable game. I intend to take as few of these liberties as possible to make an overly complicated mess of a game, which is what Card Wars presents itself as in the show. This first devlog is going to serve as an introduction to the series, so I'm going to begin by picking apart all the information and footage we're given to figure out what we already know and what rules and systems I'm going to have to fill in myself. The game is primarily shown in two episodes, Card Wars and Daddy-Daughter Card Wars, which I will now refer to as OCW and DDCW respectively, with the O in OCW meaning original, so you know I'm talking about the episode, not CW itself. Card Wars also makes appearances in Wake Up and the Distant Lands special BMO. However, in Wake Up, all we see is a throwaway cameo, and the game they show in BMO appears to be some sort of variant played holographically. I'm going to be ignoring this or addressing it later. There's not really a way to avoid making a lot of assumptions about the information we're given about Card Wars, so I apologize for how much I'm about to say, I assume, this implies, it seems like, and other similar statements. Lastly, before I begin, I'd just like to contextualize how crazy Card Wars is. We are told that this game features simulated combat, worker placement, commodity speculation, and blind auctioning. Try to remember, we're talking about a card game. Alright, now that we're past the intro, let's begin. Setup. Believe it or not, the writers are talking directly to me when they wrote this moment into OCW, which laughs in my face about this whole endeavor, but also causes the entirety of the setup to be skipped.
Now let me explain the rules. That's basically the basics.
Okay, so unlike most card games, they have a board between them. This is where all the simulated gameplay takes place. After the time skip setup occurs, both Finn and Jake have a hand of 5 cards and 2 decks, one of which is a discard pile. In front of each of them is a row of land cards, a row of creature cards, and then a row of buildings or land feature-like things, which I will refer to as structure cards for now. The creatures and structures sit under the land they occupy in the same lane. Most of the structure cards correspond to a simulated structure on the map, and some of the creatures do as well. Although many creatures and structure cards in play do not become simulated until they perform some sort of action. Interestingly, Jake also has cards hidden under other cards at the start of the game, such as the Immortal Maze Walker. As will become a theme, this is inconsistent when we move on to DDCW. The players only have one deck, and nothing except the land itself seems to start simulated on the board, despite them still starting with creature and structure cards in front of them like before. We also learn in DDCW that the land cards fill one of 4 combat lanes, which are derived from one of 16 themed elements. We hear Jake rattle off a number of these elements, but I will come up with the others later, which actually sounds super fun. A last small side note about setup is that at the beginning of the game in OCW, you have to floop your land cards to get them on the map, which makes it seem like a voluntary action, so that you could hypothetically have combat lanes on your board with unflooped land cards beneath them. Setup done, now for turns. I was about to write in the script that this is where it gets complicated, but it is all complicated. Jake is very clear that the first thing you do on your turn is discard a card and draw a new one, which is simple enough, but the only other piece of direct information we get on turn structure is the existence of a battle phase. This does, however, clue us into a general phase-based structure to the turns, so for now, I'm dividing the turns into 4 phases: draw and discard, main phase, battle phase, and end phase. With these things established, I'm going to break this next part down into more of a play-by-play since it is very erratic, and defining overarching rules for turns will require a lot more time and individual care. Jake has the first turn. He does not draw and discard, so it's likely the first player skips this step. The first thing he does is floop 1 card, which seems to be the term for using a card's special ability. He then moves onto his battle phase. He activates a unit that he already has on the board to attack, and casts a spell. Activating a card is noted to be distinct from flooping. What's interesting is that after Jake declares his attack, agency is now passed over to Finn, but he isn't purely restricted to defensive actions, and can floop his iconic pig, which indirectly stops Jake's attack, ending his turn. Finn's turn begins. He draws and discards, then plays a structure, and proceeds to floop it and another structure he already had on the board, which for some reason only simulate onto the board after being flooped despite his other buildings not requiring the same. My instinct is to assume that buildings with passive effects are always visible, and buildings with more active effects need to be flooped. Finn has played a card and flooped 2 cards. His battle phase now starts, during which he activates his Ancient Scholar creature to perform some sort of special research action, and then he moves his pig into a structure it shares a lane with. Moving the pig does not floop or activate it. These 2 turns are inconsistent but can be followed somewhat logically due to their simplicity. I've thought a lot about the difference between flooping and activating, and based on the little information we have, I believe it is that flooping a card activates its unique ability, and activating a card prompts it to perform a more general action that any card could, like attacking or studying, apparently. But maybe studying is a function of the schoolhouse it enters and not the scholar, and the creature is activating to interact with it. It's safe to assume that cards can only be activated or flooped once per turn, with both actions causing the card to be rotated to indicate that it has now exhausted its action. It isn't specified, but since Finn floops his pig on subsequent turns without performing any specific actions to unfloop it, cards likely reset and become usable again at the end or beginning of a player's turn automatically. Jake's next turn is nonsense. He skips drawing and discarding, plays a spell, and activates a creature. The activated creature attempts and fails some sort of scare action, likely made possible by the spell cast prior, and it is then implied that he could cast another spell if it were applicable. He then floops one of his structures, and afterwards casts another spell. After all this, he declares that he still has his battle phase, during which he reveals a creature from underneath one of his land cards, then activates this creature and another to attack Finn, which is where it gets even more convoluted. During Finn's reaction phase, as I will now call it, his Ancient Scholar finishes studying a new skill and uses it to revive his pig. He then floops said pig to eat Jake's corn. This once again takes care of one of Jake's attacking units indirectly. Next, Finn's Spirit Tower structure, acting on a presumed passive ability, converts the attacking Spirit Walker to his team, which makes sense, I guess. What's weird is that Jake seems surprised by this. Honestly, Jake legitimately just seems bad at this game. He is frequently surprised by simple, transparent actions that Finn takes as if they were the result of a lucky fluke strategy. He is surprised the pig can eat his corn, despite it being a built-in action of the card. He's surprised that his creatures can't scare Finn's pig to death, despite him watching it enter the Cave of Solitude. And then here he is surprised that a structure he could see on the board activated its automated passive ability against him. He genuinely has no idea what any of Finn's cards do, even though he gave Finn this deck. These are Jake's cards. You can probably see why I'm not going to keep digging into turn structure until a future video, so this is all a problem for future Caleb, who I have a very tenuous relationship with. Moving on, card types and anatomy. On the surface, this seems pretty straightforward. There are spells, creatures, structures, lands, and artifacts. We never get to see an artifact played, at least that I know of, but we get to see the text of a card that refers to them. So I know they exist, I guess. It stands to reason that most cards are also defined elementally, just like the land cards, with a card like the Husker Knights clearly being of the corn element. Even if the cards aren't categorized like this, the Immortal Mazewalker must have some sort of definition as a spirit, since it being a spirit was relevant to the ability of the Spirit Tower. Now let's talk about land cards. These do not appear to be shuffled into your deck. Your chosen 4 land cards are simply placed into the front row of your face-up cards during setup, each defining the landscape of its lane. Surprisingly, the most unhelpful and confusing information the show gives us about the cards turns out to be just what's literally shown on them. All cards have an image which takes up the majority of its face, a number on the bottom left, and its name towards the bottom with a small blurb under it with its information. The number on the cards can be a bit odd, but I think it represents the health that the card has. Most cards that are obviously creatures have a fraction instead of an individual number, which I think is safe to assume represents health and attack. The card Beanball Bomba has an X instead of a number, which probably means it's an instant spell, so it has no life. However, Cerebral Bloodstorm, which is also likely a spell, has a 10. I would imagine this is because its effect isn't instantaneous and behaves like a creature for its duration. But who knows, the spell Teleport also has a number. The issue here is that it simply isn't enough information. The cards have very little text to explain what they do, and the cards we get to see up close don't always do what their text actually says. When recreating these cards or new ones, I would like to avoid paragraphs of text if possible, so I'll likely be using lots of keywords which I will have to define later. Now for combat. Oh yeah, baby, the meat and potatoes, although actually this part isn't that long. During a player's battle phase, they can activate creatures to make them attack. Attacks can be specific and target an individual creature or structure, but there are also times when attacks are declared with no target, implying the target could be the opposing player directly. However, this wouldn't be consistent with the rest of the game, so my current assumption will be that if a non-specific attack resolves, the creatures will attack the health of the land card directly across from them. Next is the actual battling. We get to see it pretty clearly when the pig fights the Wandering Bald Man, so let's break it down. Finn activates his pig to attack the Wandering Bald Man. The pig moves through multiple lanes and onto Jake's side of the board to reach its target, which means there likely isn't any sort of movement restrictions. Once there, the two exchange blows until the man dies. There seems to be a random element there, because Finn is unsure of which will win, but this could also be due to his inexperience. That said, the damage dealt varies. The pig does one attack that does 1 damage, and then another attack that does 2. There are a few explanations for this. The most obvious is that the combat has a random element, as aforementioned, which would probably have to be resolved with dice if adapted to a tabletop game. The other explanation is that there are conditional to the damage dealt. Successive attacks could do more damage, or the pig could have been made angry once hurt and gotten stronger for his next strike. It does kind of look like he gets more mad, but this also implies the pieces have simulated emotions. These are of course just a few example ideas. Given how convoluted every other function of the game is, and that the combat is described as simulated, I assume there is far more complexity possible to these battles that we don't get to see, because the only fight we get to see is between a mostly naked man and an ordinary pig. So how do you actually win? In OCW, Jake declares himself the victor because Finn has no creatures left, which is incredibly straightforward.
You have no creatures left. That's the game, boy!
Although it is a very odd win condition for a game like this, but I suppose it's not too crazy considering you get to start the game with creatures already in play. It would be nice to close the lid and leave it at that, but there is one moment that opens it back up in DDCW. Partway through the tournament, Jake wins a tie game due to a point lead.
Cat's game! But by tourney rules, the slight point lead gives the win to Team Dignified.
Which means that, somehow, during the game, the players are scoring and tracking points. It's possible that points are only used in tournaments, but regardless, I'd still have to design the mechanic just in case people want to play this tournament style. Now before I conclude and get to work, I just want to touch on one more concept, the simulated aspect of the game that is frequently mentioned. In the show, the game operates via advanced technology or magical nonsense and has many automated systems and interactions. If I were making a video game, we could replicate this, and while that may be a fun avenue to explore at some point, certain elements will have to be altered or simulated by hand to accommodate the tabletop format that I've chosen. For example, if combat damage is random, players will have to roll dice on the table as mentioned instead of letting an invisible system take care of it. This is totally fine in my opinion, but it isn't exactly going to be the same experience as a result. I acknowledge that CardWars can only be truly replicated digitally with our current level of technology. However, working physically has many merits. It'll allow me to revise and prototype much faster, and it'll have a lot more flexibility to change systems even far into development. And most importantly, it'll make it somewhat possible to finish this in my lifetime. So like I said, the combat can be replicated on a table, but where the blizz gets real is the Wandering Bald Man. I'm serious. As the name suggests, Jake's Wandering Bald Man wanders around. However, towards the end of the game, and during Finn's turn, he appears to drift from his mud landscape onto the adjacent one naturally without direction. This has crazy implications. The game has potential to be constantly simulating all sorts of interactions and potentially have things happen even if both players just sat there and stared at each other. Which is exactly what happens. Still on Finn's turn, the Wandering Bald Man re-enters the mud landscape and sinks into the mud, getting stuck. This is presented as a completely random, uncontrollable event, which potentially had an impact on the following battle it has with the pig. If we really wanted to simplify it, it is possible to write this off as a feature of only the Wandering Bald Man, but even if that were the case, we can't do that on a real table. That is, unless we want to bring tabletop RPG elements into this and have a game master simulating the world and creatures, but we do not want to do that. So that's that. The structure and elements of CardWars in a nutshell. I didn't mention everything because I plan to break down the game and look at each aspect more carefully in future devlogs. I plan on watching the episodes a few thousand more times in slow motion, so I'll inevitably contradict myself as I draw new conclusions in future videos. This is going to get confusing, but hopefully a fun sort of confusing. Despite CardWars looking like an objectively broken game where you can lose on the first turn before you can even do anything, have all your strategy thrown out the window by an arbitrary rule, or have everything slowed to a crawl to address niche mechanics and interactions, I'm going to try to take what I'm given and actually make something fun to play. It definitely will not be balanced, but more of a game just played for fun, about, the experience and the story. Thank you so much for watching. I plan on making a lot more of these, but if you check out my channel or Twitch, I've actually been making gaming content until this point. I know that's nothing like this at all, but if you like me, it's more me, and I'd appreciate you giving it a shot. Okay. Bye.